Coming home. Mashyach. Messiah. 1. Contradicting God. The essence of religion. Yahowah's animosity toward the Gentiles who have fraudulently claimed to have inherited the blessings he gave to Yisrael continues with the next Mizmor. God is making a point, one relevant to us today, so we should listen. Additionally, he has a great deal more to say about the villainous creature identified in the lyrics of the preceding song. The psalm begins with Daud asking Yahuwah why he has distanced himself from his people and for how long he intends to remain aloof. The answer to the first question is simple, and thus, Daud wrote it for our benefit. God is setting an example we must follow to enter his home. He has separated himself from his people because they have become political and religious, emulating the ways of the Goyim. It would be hypocritical for Yahuwah to ask us to disassociate from these institutions and then endear himself to those embracing them. When his people cease being political and religious and answer his call to return home, he will come for them. And that is why this will occur on the day of reconciliations. For what reason, why and until when, is your presence so far away, distant and separated, Amad Ba Rachok, do you endure estranged and remote for such a long interval of time, Yahuwah, Yahuwah, an accurate transliteration of the name of Eloah, God guided by his Torah, instructions regarding his Hayah, existence and our Shalom, reconciliation, concealed, Alam, with you remaining unseen and disregarded, in times, Baf, during periods, of drought and destitution, of being cut off and restrained, Bat Sarah, of vexing distress when being confined to less space by adversarial rivals, and of anguishing tribulation. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 1. God intervenes in human affairs when required to honor his covenant promises, liberate or defend his people, or fulfill the Mikri Y. Otherwise, he is only seen by those who observe the written witness of the Torah and prophets. And while Yahuwah is highly communicative when working with the covenant's children, especially if we are about his business, he is otherwise unseen. This is why during the Roman siege of Jerusalem, or centuries later during the Holocaust, neither victims nor perpetrators knew him. Quite frankly, there was no one for him to speak with since he remains overtly opposed to the political, religious, military, and conspiratorial influences prevalent within human society. For most, Yahuwah is not readily or easily known. The effort required to realize that God has proven his existence as well as demonstrated his inspiration of the words found in his Torah, the time needed to discover that we can trust him, appreciate what he is offering, and appreciate what he expects in return, is considerable. To know our purpose and place in the universe takes a rational and open mind and a diligent, systematic approach to his testimony. We have to know where to look and how to approach his witness. Considering the sorry state of religious translations, we have to be willing to either learn Hebrew or embrace the tools that facilitate our understanding of God's chosen language. I have been at this for 22 years, and I'm still learning. Sharing what I've discovered, to make it easier for you, is for the purpose of an introduction to God, Yada Yahowah, observations, and coming home. What most do not yet appreciate is that coming to know Yahuwah has to be challenging to make eternity enjoyable and rewarding for everyone. To avoid allowing heaven to be like earth, there must be tests and filters. If God had provided much more than he has already given us, those without a passion for learning and exploring, those without an honest commitment to truth and to reason, would feign their acceptance of a few simple steps and contaminate the covenant with their apathy and unfounded opinions into perpetuity. As such, the Torah is both the path and the door, one which can swing open or closed. While those who come to God through his words will have been vetted along the way, through our due diligence we can find and know God. And truly, the process of learning and growing is a reward in and of itself. The phrase, Amad Ba Rachok, why do you stand away, separated, continuing to present yourself as so distant and remote for such a long interval of time, provides an interesting insight into the period in question. Apart from supporting his son while fulfilling Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim in year 4000 Yah, it would be 2,000 years later that he and the author of this song would find their identity more conspicuously disclosed. When I considered the words Yah inspired in this next statement, I was immediately taken back to the museums throughout Europe, which I had perused during years of travel. Many were dedicated to displaying the torture devices deployed by the Roman Catholic Church to anguish Jews and anyone else they didn't like. And after reading this, I now realize that those who invented and deployed such heinous contraptions will be forced to suffer their effects. You can call it divine retribution. I would call it justice. The more I learn about what they did, the more I want the political and religious Christians who authorized and encouraged the use of these torturous devices to suffer well beyond what their victims endured. This sounds like the father of lies launching his assault against Jews. With arrogance, Yahovah, with unwarranted status, the immoral and self-proclaimed, pridefully and presumptuously, with haughtiness, the dishonest, condemnable, and guilty, Rasha, those who are wrong, vexing, and unethical, overtly evil in their religious malfeasance, fraudulent and unethical behavior, with inflamed passions and burning animosity, persecute and harass, Dalek, hotly and impulsively pursue to oppress, the outspoken and unpretentious without political or religious status. Those with lower standing in society who are responsive, providing accurate testimony. Let him be seized and forced to endure, Taphaz, let him be caught in the act for having perpetrated these malicious schemes and then arrested and then suffer for what they have done, Nifle imperfect, the evil devices, Ba Mazima, within the wicked inventions and implements of their design which were part of the heinous plans, that they have imagined and conceived, Zuchashab, which they have invented and judged appropriate, even desired and esteemed. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 2. Hebrew stems and conjugations are a story in themselves, as is the case with Taphaz written in the Nifle imperfect. It reveals that those who imposed these schemes and deployed the resulting devices will endure their effects for a considerable period of time. Therefore, it is God's conclusion that it is appropriate for perpetrators to endure the pain they imposed on his people. God will not forgive them, nor should he. When they are held accountable, I don't think that church officials will enjoy the nauseating effects of the Pope's pear, the excruciating pain of Jacob's seat, the debilitating agony of their iron spider, the torturous effects of the scold's bridle, the horrific suffering of their heretic's fork, the anguishing misery of the lead sprinkler, the torment inflicted by their knee splitter, their infamous rack, the monstrous iron maiden, scavenger's daughter, or strapado, the Inquisition's Spanish donkey, head crusher, and saw torture, the overwhelming agony of being drawn and quartered, being slowly burned at the stake or boiled alive, enduring the repugnant torment of death by rats or having to endure their breaking wheel. Look them up if you want to see why Christians must endure what they have conceived and perpetrated. To forgive and forget would be a miscarriage of justice. Keep in mind that these torturous inventions were not used to encourage religious devotion but, instead, to impose the authority of the church and suppress rebellion. They were implemented to control through fear. And make no mistake, they were commonly used on Jews for no reason other than they were Jews. In the end, it all comes down to who you choose to trust. On the one hand, you have the likes of Moses, Shamuel, Daud, Yashaya, and Yirmiah, all of whom spoke for YAHOWAH, and as prophets, each proved that their witness was valid. Their revelations were meticulously maintained and are extant for our inspection among the Dead Sea Scrolls, dating to 200 BCE. They revealed the same story and were universally consistent. Foremost among them were Moses, who liberated God's people and gave us the Torah, and Daud, who united and protected Yisrael, brought us the Mizmor and Mashyach, and then served as the Passover lamb. Moses was called the greatest of the prophets while Daud was the firstborn son of God, the branch from which we would grow, the chosen and set apart one, the Messiah, the King of Kings, the embodiment of the covenant, God's strong arm, protective shepherd, and sacrificial lamb. On the other hand, you have Shaul, who would adopt the Roman moniker, Paulos. His given name means, question him. He would write about himself and on behalf of the Romans and Greeks against Yehuda and Yisrael. He never once mentions YAHOWAH's name. He only provided one prophecy to validate his opinions, and he managed to get that one wrong. Likewise, he claimed to speak for Jesus Christ and yet, on the lone occasion he quoted something attributed to his mythological misnomer, he got it wrong. Everything he wrote was in opposition to the story provided by the prophets. Even his own accounts were riddled with contradictions. And, lest we forget, God referred to him as the plague of death, the father of lies, and the son of evil. Filling out this opposing hand, you have Luke, who wrote Acts as if Paul's propagandist, Peter, who was the first to rob Daud to create the mythos of Jesus, Mark, who was a groupie used by both of them, and Matthew, the ultimate plagiarizer, none of whom were credible. It seems like a rather easy choice, and yet, in a referendum of man over God, and by a ratio of 1,000,000 to 1, the pinnacle of YAHOWAH's creation has chosen the likes of Paul, Luke, Muhammad, Akiba, and Marx over Moses, Shamuel, Daud, Yashaya, and Yirmiah. There is no excuse because we were warned. Indeed, KY, the dishonest and fraudulent, Rasha, the wicked and evil, the guilty of religious malfeasance who is wrong, improperly slanders and insanely boasts, arrogantly making a fool of himself, halal, shows a lack of respect, mocks and ridicules, such that this self-proclaimed and self-glorifying psychopath acts like a madman putting on a furious and thoughtless show praising and arrogantly lauding himself, peel perfect, based upon, according to and concerning, what his soul desires, Towrah Nepesh who, the lusts, covetousness, and greed, the cravings and longings of his own inner nature, individual consciousness, and personality. And, the one who wrongfully severs the relationship and inspires violence for ill-gotten gain, Batsa, the one who accomplishes his mission through brutal and hostile aggression born of covetousness and greed, who is dishonest and immoral, fraudulently seeking an unfair advantage while cutting people off from God, commends, pretending to bless while advocating, Barak, encourages kneeling down while admiring, praising, and blessing, that which is abhorred and condemned, despised and rejected, Naats, spurned, scorned, and treated with contempt, by YAHOWAH, YAHOWAH, God's personal and proper name, pronounced, YAHOWAH, based upon Haya, to exist. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 3. Honestly, this is hard to read. It's painful knowing that YAHOWAH's chosen ones, the recipients of his generous offer and bountiful blessings, turned on him to deliberately discredit him in the most heinous way. It is the single greatest betrayal ever perpetrated by the created against the Creator. There has never been a clearer choice between right and wrong, truth and lies, light and darkness, life and death, a relationship or religion, God versus man. This statement applies to Paul, Akiba, and Muhammad. They were wrong and knew it, making them frauds. All three fathered religions. Each was insanely arrogant, and each improperly slandered YAHOWAH. All three did so to satiate their immoral, personal desires. Individually and collectively, they inspired horrific violence against God's people, and two of the three, Muhammad excluded because he knew nothing of it, severed the most important relationship in the universe, the covenant between Yah and his people. In their writings, again, excluding the illiterate Muhammad, we find them consistently advocating the very things YAHOWAH abhors and condemns. It matters not if you are a Jew or Gentile. To engage in a relationship with YAHOWAH, you must first disassociate from the likes of Paul, Akiba, and Muhammad. They were wrong. Their arrogance is worthy of condemnation, not acceptance, devotion, or praise. Walk away from them and everything they have poisoned. This referendum is life or death, so as a concerned father, our God is continuing to expose and condemn the father of lies and the son of evil. The deceitful one who is wrong, Rasha, the fraudulent, wicked, and evil one guilty of leading others astray by engaging in religious activity which is hostile to God, dishonest regarding the proper standard, opposite of what is right and opposed to the Torah and who speaks contrary to it, who is vexing and unethical, as if in a lofty position, exalts in the arrogance, Kagoba, inappropriately elevates his stature and worth such that he is conceitedly lifted up and venerated as great in Spite, of his resentment and animosity, Afhu, of his angry countenance, temper, ire, and wrath. He will never, Baal, he is unable and cannot, he accomplishes nothing and thus fails to, seek after or inquire about him, Darash, turn to him or resort to him, consult with or care about him. All, Kol, of his decisions, schemes, and thoughts, Mazimahu, deductions and determinations, his plans and purposes, his mischievous and wicked intentions and inventions, contradict and negate, Ein, are contrariwise, lacking, without, and devoid of, God, Elohim. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 10 verse 4. Resentment lies at the heart of Paul's, Akiba's, and Muhammad's motivations. Foolishly, indeed, arrogantly, they decided to make God pay for their perceived slights. Paul was a failed rabbi. Muhammad was a deadly marauder. Akiba was a failed revolutionary. Halal ben Shakar, brightly shining son of darkness, more commonly known as Satan, became the adversary because he resented Yahowah's devotion to humankind. Resentment is the underlying motivation for most of man's most heinous and selfish endeavors. As a modern exemplar, consider Adolf Hitler. His resentment grew out of blaming others for his failure to gain admittance to art school, his frustration with not achieving the fame he sought as a courier in World War I, his inability to accept the consequences of Germany losing the war, and out of resenting Jews because they were smarter, more supportive of one another, and more successful than him. One man's festering resentments led to the loss of 50 million lives. And yet, Hitler was a piker compared to Paul, Akiba, or Muhammad. Such men speak for themselves, not God. In fact, they typically model their gods after themselves. In Paul's letters, it is only Paul's words that matter. When God's words appear, they are always misappropriated and twisted to serve Paul's agenda, making his the most important voice. As for Muhammad, Allah was his alter ego. The man and his God were indistinguishable. And in Judaism, the Talmud is now called Torah, and its citations always delineate the contributing rabbi's name while Yahowah's is never mentioned. Such men are not confident but, instead, conceited, more paranoid and diabolical than worthy. Even when one is supremely enabling and the other corrosive and debilitating, the distinction between confidence and conceit is lost on most people while God cherishes one and disdains the other. Yahowah, with his overwhelming presence, enormous personality, and grand agenda isn't for the timid, although he cannot tolerate the arrogant. From the scope of his Torah to the breadth of his prophets, everything with God is supersized, well beyond the mightiest of empires. Therefore, to approach him and to work with him as one with their Father, in fact, while knowing that the fulfillment of his agenda and the fate of his people are on the line, requires character forged in fire. Yes, God does all the heavy lifting, but his implements cannot fold or flee under pressure. To make this possible, such that mortal men and women can learn from and then work alongside him, God does three things. First, he picks men and women who are battle-tested, who have faced adversity without crumbling, who have risked everything for a noble cause, and who have experienced failure, then grown past it, becoming better prepared. So long as one of the lessons learned along the way was to never trust human institutions, such soul is ripe for the choosing, especially if he or she is ready to rely on the Almighty. He or she can then be groomed to serve as a useful intermediary and implement. Second, Yahowah empowers and enlightens his people such that they can more effectively represent him. And he protects them so that they are able to accomplish the mission. Third, God's testimony builds confidence. Not only does he prove his existence and his inspiration throughout the Torah and prophets, but he also shares examples of what he and others have achieved previously. Recognizing what Yahowah enabled through Abraham, Yitzhak, and Jacob, Moses and Daud, even Deborah and Gideon is inspiring. The key, of course, is being willing to listen and learn while remaining reliant. We see these traits reflected brilliantly throughout Daud's life and lyrics. Having been chosen at 8 years old, he had already unceremoniously distinguished himself by fighting lions and bears to protect his flock, demonstrating his character. And thereafter, Daud became empathetic because his life was so tumultuous, replete with the highest of highs and lowest of lows. His journey, in concert with his Mizmor and Mashal, particularly his 19th and 119th songs, served as preparation for the many essential roles he would play in our lives. It is what made Daud God's Gibbor most confident and capable man. It is what made it possible for the Bakar to be the Zeroath sacrificial lamb without flinching. Therefore, rather than being the source of depression, rejection and failure can be the training grounds for success. Risk can have its rewards. It all comes down to attitude and reliance. With these words, Daud has affirmed something we have long known but have struggled to convey in a way that others appreciate. Effective liars, such as the aforementioned trio, always weave strands of truth throughout their proclamations such that their deceptions appear credible, at least to those without good judgment. However, no matter how magnificent it looks, how delightful it smells, how delectable it tastes, how satisfying it seems, or how much of it there is, poison is always toxic. It is no less deadly when placed within an apple pie than it would be sprinkled on a cow patty, other than we'd all be more susceptible to it served a la mode. Lies presented in the midst of what believers consider scripture is akin to placing them within a pie. A counterfeit bill is worthless, in fact, illegal, and yet, the best of them is 99.99% accurate. The more consistent they are with the genuine article, the more effective the fraud. Such is the underlying deception underpinning every religion. It is how Satan fooled Chawah in the Garden of Eden, twisting Yahowah's message by adding his own spin. While their additions were far more prevalent, and the spin was far more disorienting, it was the identical strategy. Paul, Akiba, and Muhammad deployed it to make their mumblings appear divine. Since their lies were plentiful and obvious, those who knew these psychopaths best, those who listened to them in person, saw Paul, Akiba, and Muhammad as self-serving, mean-spirited frauds. Each of these men blamed their fellow Jews rather than their lack of character or their irrational rhetoric as the reason they were being rejected. Damn the torpedoes, they remained recalcitrant. Akiba was a special case in this regard. According to Rabbi Alan Mahler's interpretation of the Talmud, Yebamot 62b, tens of thousands of Jewish boys joined Akiba's private army to fight the Romans based upon the promise that Bar Kokhba was actually the Messiah. However, some 12,000 of those who were not stricken by the Romans died of a strange disease. Then Akiba's pacifist students started dropping like flies. At the time, Akiba was against the ropes. Rabbi Yohanan ben Tordah openly challenged Akiba's pronouncements regarding Bar Kokhba's legitimacy and thus Akiba's credibility. Also troubling, the epidemic was otherworldly when it began spreading during Hanukkah. Those who would defend the father of Judaism found their tongues turning bright blue and swelling, preventing them from talking. Death followed, such that, by Passover, many hundreds were dying each day. So, according to Rabbi Mahler, the father of the diaspora claimed that his yeshiva students were dying because they did not show sufficient respect for those whose preference was to die being hacked to death by the Romans. Then, when boys in Akiba's private army started dying from blue tongue, their deaths were blamed on insubordination. So, rather than show sympathy for those he had lured to their deaths by lying to them about YAHOWAH as Messiah, the deaths of 24,000 young men were blamed on the victims. They were said to have lacked respect, with the inference that GD killed them. The aforementioned Rabbi Yohanan ben Tordah, who thought they were dying due to Akiba's messianic illusions, made his famous declaration at this time, saying, Akiba, grass will come up between your cheeks and still the son of David will not have come. Talmud Yerushalmi Towrah 4, August 27. Once men like Akiba headed down their road to oblivion with Satan as their guide, there was no turning back and no hope of salvation. The lemmings who would follow them would fall off the cliff of life and reason, believing that God would somehow prevent the death that they had made inevitable, as if God would negate their free will. These three men were among the least godly in human history. Their legacy is one of deceit, destruction, oppression, and death. From the beginning, this Mizmor, and the one which preceded it, has spoken critically of such scandalous souls. Therefore, among the three, we can either accept the fact that Shaul has already been identified as the adversary, or we can consider the nature of the rebuke to determine that the others are also an adroit fit. That said, more than anyone, Paul's spoken and written testimony contradicts God's witness. It was Paul who sought to negate what Yahuwah has done and said on our behalf by taking what God revealed out of context and twisting his words. It was Paul who was admittedly the most arrogant of the three. And there is more. Throughout time, Ba Kol Heth, always in time and given the right circumstance, his way, Dereku, his path, endures replete with twisted perversions as he dances about causing anguishing torment. Chul is perverted and brings forth misery and suffering, torture and torment, fear and distress even for the faithful. Your means to exercise good judgment and justly resolve disputes, Mishpat Ada, your approach to justice, to rational thinking, to determining right from wrong, to being discriminating and discerning, and inquiring about the means to make good decisions, are elevated high above and beyond, Marom Min, are dignified well outside, what is before him and conspicuous in his sight, Negtu, what is easily seen by him, obvious and openly exposed to him for a reason, corresponding to a straightforward purpose which serves as the counterpart to him and is opposite to him. With all, Ba Kol, of his troubles and adversity, Serahu, of the times he is bound or distressed, tied up or shut up, shown any form of hostility or being confined, he becomes a loud-mouthed blowhard, Puwatch, he resorts to scoffing and snickering, mindless puffery, inflaming others in the process, pouring out a maligning witness, regarding them, Ba Hem. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 5. While this was written of a single charlatan, all three candidates were thin-skinned, always ready to demean their adversaries. Akiba and Muhammad silenced their foes in murderous fashion, while Paul was the most condescending and belligerent. The tone of Shaul's letters is that of a vicious con man with an acerbic personality and an irritating ego. His grasp on reality was tenuous. His arguments were littered with all manner of fallacies. He never once accurately quoted the God he claimed to serve, and his every word contradicted and annoyed him. As a deficient speaker, writer, and thinker, and as an obvious fraud, it took just the right circumstances at just the right moment in time for his misguided rhetoric to take precedence over the Messiah's, and for his religion to become popular. His twisted perversions endure largely because they appealed to the egos and xenophobia of Romans and Greeks, and they were compatible with their religious nomenclature and myths. Paul made these Gentiles, and thus Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians, feel good about despising Jews, their Torah, and their God, justifying their racial hatred while assuaging their propensity to subjugate those they believed were inferior. As Rome was brutalizing and enslaving Jews, Paul's ode to the Romans, in the 13th chapter of his book by the same name, was music to their ears. The Romans and Greeks to whom Paul's lies appealed were similarly vicious and egotistical, equally devoted to imposing their will on others, robbing them of their liberty, property, and lives, all in the name of the gods they had conceived in their image. They had no interest in Yahuwah, his Torah, his covenant, his prophets, his Messiah, his chosen people, Yisrael, Yehudah, or anything Hebrew. They had much in common with the man who had wooed them by telling them what they wanted to hear. In all of Shaul's mind-numbing rhetoric, verbose elaborations, grandiose claims, and pervasive contradictions, it is his perverted reasoning and twisted citations which enable the informed and rational to realize that there is nothing about God in Paul's words. His letters, along with his mission as told in the book of Acts, were all about him and his inner demons. The fact is, just as there was never any distinction between Muhammad and Allah, Paul screamed much more loudly than his Christ. In the end, he was nothing more than a loud-mouthed blowhard, bellowing on behalf of the adversary. When we read Daud's Psalms and then Shaul's letters, it is immediately obvious that God's ways were well beyond Paul's grasp. There were no redeeming insights from the Torah, maybe, Wa Mizmor to be found in his letters, just negations of them. And that may be the biggest failing for the religious. They not only accept easily disproven fallacies, but the lies they have come to believe were also deliberately placed such that they conceal the truth. Therefore, they missed the majesty of Yahuwah's message, especially as conveyed by the rightful Mashyach Messiah. By reading Paul's letters, we know that he was an ill-tempered advocate for the demon he admitted possessed him. His constant complaining about imagined hardships and insults were all concocted such that his mythical sufferings would supersede what Yahuwah and Dowd did for us on Pesach, Matzah, and Bikurim. This is among the most irritating aspects of his persona. Well, maybe not the most annoying because we still have to deal with his irrational approach, errant citations, and his self-aggrandizing ego. He has said, Amar, he will declare, through his reasoning, Ba Lebhu, in his heart, from his inclination and attitude, I shall never be shaken, waver, or falter, Bal Mot, nothing will cause me to slip, to be dislodged or overthrown, and I will never be cast down or decay, throughout the generations, times, and places, Wadower, such that, Asher, I am never in the wrong or considered the adversary. Lo Bara, I'm not distressed about being errant. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 10 verse 6. When considering Yisrael's most formidable foes, Paul, Akiba, and Muhammad, while the apostles' reasoning was fallacious, the cognitive capability of Allah's messenger was non-existent. And in Paul's case, to a greater extent than his speeches or writings, which isn't saying much, his foregoing self-assessment was at least marginally accurate, albeit on one point. While Shaul died a miserable death, alone and rejected, his letters, riddled as they were with contradictions and inaccuracies, were resurrected to serve as the basis of the most popular religion in human history. That is not to say that he deserved such an infamous distinction. The Romans who capitalized upon his words were able to create a beast out of them that would trample the world, doing so for nearly 100 generations. As for not being adversarial, never being cast down, or not being wrong, not so much. The key to understanding Muhammad, Allah, and the Quran is also in this pronouncement. The adversary who possessed and inspired him needed to shirk his ha-Satan designation to be addressed as if he were God. So, when we see someone who is so obviously speaking for Satan claiming that he will never be seen as the adversary, we are witnessing Satan in action. Satan seeking to conceal his true identity to be worshipped as God is central to his agenda. Yahuwah, through Dowd, has said and done more than enough for even the most pea-brained human to ascertain the ugly truth about Shaul Paul, the principal character, actor, and writer of the Christian New Testament. And he isn't done excoriating him. His mouth, Pehu, his lips and speech, is filled with an abundance, male, is overflowing with loud and vociferous proclamations, fulfilling this prophecy with a massive conglomeration, of vile insults and injurious curses invoking divine retribution, Allah, of exceedingly harmful sworn public statements regarding a covenant with detrimental binding stipulations which leads to sanctions, of unfit and improper false oaths causing lamentable and sorrowful eulogies. In addition, he deliberately misleads using deceitful deceptions, murmur, he is perpetrating an outright fraud, a dishonest and treacherous betrayal filled with false narratives and self-serving words and deeds, using subtle and crafty guile, encouraging feigned and disappointing worship, ponder the implications of Rama, being beguiled, deceived, and misled, treacherously tricking the unsuspecting into religious devotion and disillusionment in a place of worship, along with even distressful spoken statements which create a state of oppression, talk, deceitful expressions leading to being controlled by others, to fraud, extortion, serious injury, and subjugation. It is a consequence of, takhath, it is systematically and deliberately caused by and succeeds based upon, his nauseatingly, amal, distressing and unpleasant, perverse and wicked, wearisome and toilsome, evil and corrupting, injurious and damaging, misfortunate and unfavorable, false and idolatrous, erroneous and mischievous, tongue, lashonhu, language and speech. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 10 verse 7. This is Dowd's appraisal of Shaul Paul, the stones of aspersion he has cast from his sling. The brightest mind, the most articulate writer, the most beloved and acclaimed prophet of God did not mince words in his condemnation of this man who sought to rob and then bury him. And should you believe that God's ongoing denunciation isn't directed at Paul, then I encourage you to search the annals of human history to find someone else who has had a longer or more extensive negative influence on Dowd's people or who has done so in the manner herein described. And when we recognize how caustic Christianity has been to Jews over the millennia, it becomes even harder to ignore the principal author of the New Testament. Worse yet, Akiba foisted his false messiah on his people in response to what Paul had done by robbing Dowd, thereby creating Judaism and causing the diaspora, all to counter Shaul's influence. Put it all together and the identity of this deplorable individual is patently obvious. But should you be uncertain, either read Twistianity or do what I have done, systematically contrast Yahuwah's testimony with Paul's to demonstrate that Shaul's mouth was filled with an abundance of vile insults and injurious statements and that he deliberately misled believers by perpetrating an outright fraud, putting the faithful in opposition to God by corrupting Yahuwah's Torah teaching while misappropriating everything Dowd has done for the covenant family. Throughout time, those who have insulted God with their arrogant claims have threatened divine retribution on anyone who didn't capitulate. Foremost among them was Paul, followed by the Romans he influenced and empowered. His false narratives have done more to harm Jews and have done so for a longer period of time than all of the other con men combined. Further, unlike Muhammad or Akiba, Paul did it all with words, with a deliberately duplicitous tongue. Should you have wondered if Shaul knew he was lying, or if he was simply misled by Satan, that question has been answered. Paul purposely and knowingly led billions of souls away from God, robbing Jews and Gentiles alike of any hope of salvation. The most compassionate among us despise him as a result. Shaul, like the one who possessed him, was crafty. Once his letters were accepted as scripture, even from the grave, Paul was positioned to ambush the unsuspecting, with his snare out in the open in plain sight. He lurks in ambush, Yasha Ba Myrab, he sits and dwells, abiding and remaining to ensnare and trap, lying in wait to harm those who approach him, surprising them openly in the courtyards of communities, Ba Hachatzer, right out in the open, perpetrating his crime in public view, in towns and cities, blowing his horn as part of the orchestra, his intent carefully concealed. While the central figure, he's not easily recognized or openly forthcoming, YAHOWAH MUSIC, not commonly acknowledged or held accountable for his leading role due to him concealing his motives, as he kills, forestalling the lives, Harag, he kills, causing the death, intentionally ending the lives, of the innocent, Naki, of the uncorrupted who otherwise would not be to blame, of those free from punishment and exempt from obligations, from Naka, empty vessels, clear of entanglements, free of contaminants, and blameless regarding pollutants, otherwise innocent. His sights are set, Einhu, his eyes and his focus are, on the unfortunate victims, Laka, on the hapless ones who are harmed and should be pitted, related to Chawal, to be defiled and to be common, waylaying them, soften, ambushing and crippling them while concealing his intent such that he isn't identified as the culprit by them. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 10 verse 8. The last place most would expect Satan to be championed, to be worshipped as if he were God, would be in churches, temples, and mosques. And yet, that is where we find Paul's, Akiba's, and Muhammad's Lord. It is in houses of prayer and worship, inside the most prominent and respected edifices erected by man, that the adversary has laid his trap, forestalling the lives of believers. It has been that way since the dawn of the human experience. It is the most relevant and least understood conundrum on earth. This is Satan's most stellar achievement and mankind's most egregious crime, religiously replacing the Creator with the adversary. Billions of souls have been waylaid in the process, victimized by the devil as they sought to worship God. The calculus behind this loathsome achievement is actually rather simple. Satan must disguise his, Satan, the adversary, depiction if he is to accomplish his stated mission, which, in the context of Babylon, is to rise above the Most High. The easiest, indeed the only, way to affect the desired perspective of being perceived as superior to Yahowah is to be worshipped by men as if he were God. Beginning in Babylon, the Lord has used the overtly religious and political as his stooges, confusing the ignorant and irrational into elevating him above the Almighty. Just as he did with Chawah in the garden, he misappropriates Yahowah's testimony and then intermixes it with his own special blend of Babel. To get humankind to play along, all Satan had to do was exploit the worst among us, playing to the egos, the thirst for power, riches, and carnal desires of the likes of Paul, Akiba, and Muhammad. As long as they were willing to share a portion of their ill-gotten gain with underlings, as long as they were sufficiently fearsome and militant while still offering hope for a better life in the hereafter, the resulting religious and political, military, and economic alliances were readily able to subdue the masses. People would go along with their program or die. Once these religious and governmental, militaristic and economic orders were intertwined by commingling myths with reality, the resulting concoctions became sufficiently seductive to become popular and, indeed, commonplace. Therefore, Satan, knowing the truth, counterfeited just enough of Yahowah's intent through the strokes of each religious scheme to appear credible. Although Satan, by whatever name, is the central figure of each religion, the more he has allowed man to imbue him with human characteristics, the more comfortable people have become relating to and worshipping him. To effect this result in the world's most popular religion, Satan had one of his most debilitating demons possess Shaul, a savage, immoral, and covetous man, on the road to Damascus. In control of the Romanized incarnation of the self-acclaimed rabbi, Paul would create the religion Imperial Rome used to subdue the world under the Roman Catholic Church. And that is how the final beast, the whore of Babylon, was born. It would then thrive by consuming the vulnerable and unwary, beginning with Jews. Deceived, Christians claim that they are following Jesus, even though he never existed, when it is obvious that Paul's words have led them to this place, the religious, political, or geographic incarnation of Babylon. While Shaul will forever be the central figure in Christianity, by cleverly disguising his role behind the man-god Paul crafted to serve his interest, he is not easily recognized as such. Nonetheless, the words following, "But I, Paul, say," would take precedence over anything Dowd wrote or Yahowah inspired in the lives of the Gentiles, beginning with Romans and Greeks. While Shaul Paul remains the villain in Satan's story, he was not the first or the last to do the devil's bidding. Ezekiel is Satan's autobiography and playbook. And yet, even though it demonizes and dehumanizes Jews, buries Jerusalem, and obstructs the micro-EY with the cannibalistic expression of the Eucharist, it was placed in the midst of Yahowah's prophets by Jews. Such is also the case with Job, Jonah, Enoch, and Esther, to name a few others, which are as counterproductive and as out of place as the Talmud and New Testament. They do not belong. This snare was laid right out in the open, along the path people thought that they were following to God. It was disguised under the popular and glittering trappings of religion. He has set a deceptive trap for humans, Arab, he is lying in wait and ready to attack, lurking in ambush in his lair like a thief, kidnapper, or assassin, shrewdly and covertly weaving a ruse, spinning a web of lies and intertwining a twisted snare, then waiting, ready to ambush people by catching them unaware, using his ability to craft stories about idols through artifice and trickery, where the identity of the one disguising his intent isn't recognized, YAHOWAH MUSIC, with his eyes and face turned, averting examination, such that his agenda isn't readily predictable even though he is the prime suspect, a chameleon, remaining so for a substantial length of time, yet not commonly acknowledged or recognized for his leading role in what has been perpetrated. He has done so in the manner of a ferocious and destructive predator, similar to a lion or fierce and aggressive enemy, used to depict a person prone to devour others as a cruel adversary, from Ara, the traveler and wanderer going from one place to another whose destiny is to violently pluck away, from within his tents that he uses to screen his presence, in his temporary dwelling places which are covered in a screening mesh to partially conceal what's inside the less illuminated interior from the brighter exterior, cunningly commingling and deceptively twisting everything to craftily ensnare, Arab, shrewdly and covertly weaving together a trap, spinning a web and intertwining a snare, then lying in wait ready to ambush victims, killing them by catching them unaware, acting as a thief, kidnapper, and assassin using the ability to craft stories about idols through pretense and deception. In this way, he seizes, lachataf, he afflicts, catches and takes without their consent, the oppressed and persecuted, the afflicted deprived of status who are impoverished, suffering harassment and hardship. He abducts and carries off, chataf, he catches, seizes, and takes without consent, those he has deprived of rights and resources, the oppressed and persecuted, the afflicted robbed of status who are impoverished, suffering harassment and hardship, by drawing them into, by forcefully dragging them to and then taking them away in, his net, rishay, his trap used to confine his captives, from yerash, to seize and dispossess, to disinherit and impoverish. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 10 verse 9. Progressives demand reparations for Africans enslaving Africans and selling a relatively insignificant percentage of them 350 years ago, but no one is advocating reparations for Jews who were robbed of their possessions, freedom, dignity, and lives, not only by the Romans and Roman Catholics as one evolved into the other, but also by Europeans within the past 75 years. More than any other people, Jews have been deprived of rights and resources. And no one has done more to put them in harm's way than Shaul. This Benjamite wolf would be their most vicious predator. According to Shaul, prior to rabbinical school, he was a tent maker, most likely for the Roman legions. He is now being shown using them to conceal his intended purpose and actual identity. He would lurk among the people as the thief of souls, camping out like a pedophile next to a school. And as we have seen, his approach was predicated upon deceptively twisting God's testimony, cleverly commingling the tainted result with a steady diet of his own contradictions. The resulting brew was as intoxicating for Gentiles as it was debilitating for Jews. Those who cower and bow down in submission, shachak, those who collapse, downcast and downtrodden, hopelessly and helplessly bowing their heads, he crushes and destroys, daka, he disparages and pummels. Treated as inferior, his victims fall, naphal kalaka, the unfortunate are cast from a higher position to a lower one, by the multitudes associated with him, at some who, by the throngs of people who accomplish his purposes. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 10 verse 10. In our quest to affirm the identity of this lone assailant, we have just been given a remarkably important clue. Multitudes are not only influenced by him, but they also seek to disparage and destroy Yahuwah's people, treating them as undeserving and inferior. This narrows the field to two infamous individuals, Paul, the founder of Christianity, and Muhammad on behalf of Islam. Jews would be humiliated and abused by both religions. While more easily said than done, God does not want us to cower or bow down in submission, regardless of the consequence. Doing so makes an entire population easier to manipulate and thus abuse. We are called to be like Daud and, thus, courageous in disavowing and discrediting harmful institutions. Yahuwah recognizes that standing up for him and for what is right in the face of systematic Roman Catholic, Islamic, communist, or fascist subjugation would have had torturous and deadly consequences for those not protected by him for being about his business. And yet, from his perspective, when it comes to man's most heinous ways, defiance is better than acquiescence. The following position is Paul's, not Akiba's or Muhammad's. From his disposition and inclination, Lebhu, in his judgment and in his mind and heart, based upon his motivations, feelings, and thoughts, he says, Amar, he suggests, God, isn't mindful, he no longer responds appropriately, and thus he should be ignored, Shaka, he is oblivious and no longer cares, he is forgetful and should be forgotten, he is no longer knowable or remembered, having concealed himself and vanished, he cannot be found, he is obsolete and thus no longer matters or exists, Cal perfect, literally at this time. His presence, Panahu, his appearance and face, his identity and the very perception of him, will not be observed or seen, Baal Allah, can no longer be revealed or perceived, is never shown and seldom considered, is undiscernible and thus negated. Note, Baal and Bel, the Lord, God of Babylon, are scribed identically in Hebrew, for the foreseeable future, Lanetzak, for the rest of time. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 10 verse 11. According to this adversarial individual, God is not only unresponsive, but he also cannot be observed. The implication is, therefore, to believe whatever Paul and his pals postulate about him. In this vacuum of their own making, they positioned their Dionysian, Jesus, as part of a Babylonian trinity. Replacement theology not only transferred Yahuwah's promises on behalf of Yisrael to the Gentile church, it misdirected what God granted to Daud such that it was bequeathed upon the Christian Christ. The absentee and unknowable God of the Old Testament was discarded such that he was replaced by a God whose presence was more easily perceived, a God made in the image of man. Even for an egomaniac of Paul's repute, this is an extraordinarily bold position to take in opposition to the living God. And yet, it is the primary justification for the Christian New Testament, the Talmud, and the Quran. If this was not the case, come up with another explanation as to why God would want or need someone to pursue a different means to knowledge, living, and salvation, especially those which contradict and demean his own. Daud knew that Shaul was wrong and wanted God to rise up against him. The Messiah saw Yah as he really is, intolerant and uncompromising of those who would deceive Gentiles such that they would abuse Jews. And this is Paul's ultimate legacy. You and I are in agreement that you must take a stand, Kyum, it is my desire and your decision to stand up, choosing to rise up against him, cal imperative, paragogic he, cohortative, an expression of volition in first and second person, spoken in a way that is mutually agreed and emphatic to rise up in opposition, Yahowah, the proper pronunciation of the name of Eloah, God as directed in his Torah, teaching regarding his Hayah. You have decided to lift up your hand, Nasa, yet Ada, you will choose to raise your fist and bear your influence, cal imperative, God, El, Almighty, depicted in Paleo Hebrew as a ram, who is the leader and protector of the flock and a shepherd's staff. You will never overlook or forget, al-Shaka, you will remember, and never ignore, always continuing to care about, Kal imperfect Jussiv, those who have been demeaned, impoverished, and persecuted, any, the afflicted and oppressed, those deprived of status, rights, and resources, who are forced to live in ghettos. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 12. As king and shepherd, God's beloved son recognized that for justice to prevail and for there to be healing, those who are evil must be held accountable. There has to be a consequence for corrupting the truth because millions have been abused and billions have been misled. Dowd had a backbone, and he sought justice, as does God. To ignore or forget, and thus to forgive the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Roman Catholics, the Muslims, the Europeans, the communists, the conspirators, or the progressives for delegitimizing and dehumanizing Jews, and for the subsequent harm they have inflicted upon his people, would make Yahowah an accessory after the fact. It isn't going to happen. There will be a day of judgment. Those who have demeaned, impoverished, or persecuted Jews, who have sought to deprive them of their rightful status, will be condemned for perpetrating the most ungodly crime in human history. This next question is asked by Dowd of a single Rasha individual. We are, therefore, encouraged to ponder its implications within this very narrow scope. It is the legacy of one nefarious fellow that this Mizmor psalm has been assailing from the beginning, one who has not only had the most negative influence on Yisrael and Yehudah, but also one who is still adversely influencing God's people at this time. On what basis and for what reason does, Alma, toward what purpose and end, over what, why, and how does, the fraudulent one who is wrong, Rasha, the wicked and evil one who is guilty of religious malfeasance, the one engaged in criminal activity who is hostile to God, the one who is dishonest regarding the proper standard, who is the opposite of right, who is vexing and unethical, especially ungodly, the one contemned for crimes against society, discredit and renounce, contradict and negate, naats, demean and despise, reject and treat with contempt, dishonor and revile, provoke and spurn, peel perfect, for a time, the object is affected by the subject, God, Elohim. Based upon his inclinations, B.A. Lebhu, in his judgment and heart, based upon his thinking and feelings, he says, Amar, he claims, you will not care about or account for this, lo, Darash, you will not question me or hold me accountable. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 13. Dowd is a man of letters and logic, of evidence and reason. He knows right from wrong, the difference between that which is true and false. As such, he realizes that Christianity is fraudulent, a deliberate hoax. He understands that its claims discredit, contradict, negate, and renounce the words of the God he has come to know and love. Frankly, while it ought to be obvious to any informed and rational person today, it is telling that Dowd exposed the religion that terrorized his people 1,000 years before it was conceived. I have surmised that this is the reason for the conflict between Shaul and Dowd circa 1050 BCE. Dowd's bout with the demon-possessed and Torah-adverse Shaul, as the popular choice for king, was prophetic of this debate between the Messiah and the enormously admired, demon-possessed apostle of the Gentiles. Dowd is predicting that Shaul will be so brazen, so arrogant and presumptuous, that he will contradict God, believing that he will get away with his debilitating crime. This is to infer that Paul believed that he would rule over the world as Satan's apostle. The son of evil came to reflect the father of lies, causing the plague of death. For most of the past 2,000 years, the devil's advocate has achieved the status both he and his mentor craved. Shaul is the principal author of the world's most popular religion, and Satan is worshipped as its god. I have proved 1,000 times over through evidence and reason within the 5 volumes of Twistianity, often by comparing Shaul's pronouncements to Yahowah's testimony, that Paul was deliberately lying. However, there was a simpler way to discredit his letters, one which I shared early and often. The notion that God failed so miserably that he gave up, unable to save anyone or even communicate effectively, and then authorized a murderous, demon-possessed, barely literate, Roman-affiliated, irrational con man to contradict him and demean his people by misappropriating his testimony and misquoting him, is preposterous. To believe Paul requires ignorance of the Torah and prophets to such an extent that Paul can contradict the word of God without consequence. To believe Paul, one has to believe that he was not only superior in intellect and vastly more articulate than Yahowah, but also that God was no longer responsive. To believe Paul requires a repudiation of logic, evidence, and reason. And that is why Shaul demeaned the Jews who could prove him wrong while appealing to Greeks and Romans who, steeped in paganism, knew nothing of the God of the Torah and prophets. To believe Paul requires antipathy toward Yahowah's beloved Son, his Messiah, our Savior. It hasn't gone unnoticed. However, by contrast, you do see for yourself, you witness, perceive, notice, and observe on your own, the effort that is put forth to create perversions causing trouble and misery, amal, that which is distressing and unpleasant, overly wearisome and perverse, requiring burdensome toil and an enormous amount of work. And, you do consider, Nabat, you observe, perceive, and respond appropriately to, these as annoying provocations, kaas, grief and sorrow, anxiety and sadness based upon that which is twisted, vexing, irritating, indignant, and wrong, therefore, taking, la Nathan, receiving, into your hands for yourself, yet ada, within your influence unto yourself, those who remain and who have renounced prior affiliations, Azab, the rejected and forsaken who have left, the apostates, who are now free of allegiances. Those who have been victimized, Kalaka, those who have been harmed to the point they should be pitied, the impoverished and disenfranchised, and the fatherless, Yatham, the orphan, from Yather, those who remain and are searching in Yather, the remnant left behind, you exist to, Adahaya, you have and you will, aid and support, Azar, assist and help, increase and augment. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 14. There will be a time of reckoning, of setting things right again. Hell's angels, the proponents of religion and politics, will be exposed and condemned for the misery they have inflicted. These annoying provocations of God's people will not be overlooked. In the end, and upon his return, Yahowah will comfort those who remain and who have finally answered his call to come out of Babylon. Those who have severed prior political and religious affiliations will be embraced by God. The fatherless orphans who continue to seek their heavenly Father will find that he exists, ready and willing to assist them. During this time of reconciliation, for the earth to return to the conditions found in the Garden of Eden, the religious and political, military and economic influences that have polluted it must be eliminated. Your will is to crush, Shabar, you want to shatter and destroy, smashing and crippling, Kal imperative, the leadership capabilities, Zeroah, the ability to shepherd and protect, the strength of the arm and reach, the potency and capability, the power to guide and influence, of the deceitful one who is wrong and religious, Rasha, the fraudulent, wicked, and evil one guilty of leading others astray by engaging in criminal activity which is hostile to God, dishonest regarding the proper standard, opposed to what is right, and opposed to the Torah and who speaks contrary to it, who is vexing and unethical, especially ungodly, this one who by being evil severs the relationship through improper means, YRA, the one who is immoral, irrational, undesirable, and injurious, grievously evil, malignant, and disagreeable, who is villainous and corrupting as a loud-mouthed countryman, accounting for, Darash. Responding appropriately after a thoughtful evaluation such that everyone is held responsible for their actions. His fraudulent religious malfeasance, Rasha, who, his wicked and evil criminal activity, his hostility toward God, his dishonest degradation of the proper standard, his propensity to be wrong, his opposition to the Torah, and his vexing and unethical approach, until you find that there is nothing left to be uncovered, Baal Matzah, until there is nothing left for you to learn, find, or discover. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 15. God is going to cripple those who have led their flock away from him, whether believers, citizens, or soldiers. The snake isn't as dangerous without its head. The wolf will be defanged. In a way, it is disconcerting to see Zeroah deployed in this negative light, and yet, we know that Satan is a counterfeiter by nature, making it appropriate and instructive. There is both a trustworthy as well as an errant shepherd, a beneficial covenant and one which is decidedly counterproductive. The outreach of false prophets can be so considerable that the sheep stop following Moses and learning from Dowd and wander aimlessly away. In this context, then Zeroah speaks of seeds of estrangement that were sown by the world's most infamous shepherd. This is the Rasha of Paul and Akiba in contrast to the Tzaddak of Moses and Dowd. Although the lexicons don't mention it, there is a connection between Rasha, deceiving by being wrong, and Ara, being irrational, improper, immoral, and injurious. Shaul was both, and therefore, Yahowah is going to hold him accountable. And according to what we have just read, God is going to do an infinitely better job than what I've attempted, which is to expose and condemn every false statement, errant citation, irrational conclusion, and twisted expression Paul ever uttered and scribed. That isn't as easy as it may sound. It only takes a handful of words to create a lie, but it requires 10 to 100 times that many to prove something false. And between his speeches in Acts and 14 letters, there are thousands of RA statements. Based upon something Yahowah inspired Yashayah to write, speaking of the world's leadership bowing in judgment, I suspect that all of those who used Paul's words to advance their political and religious agendas will be co-defendants during what is sure to be a prolonged and indicting presentation by the prosecution. And while I've admittedly done an inferior job, my methods have been valid when it comes to excoriating Paul and his ilk. This trial will proceed by comparing Yahowah's words with Shaul's Paul's, contrasting the truth with the lie. God is right, and so, when someone annuls something he has revealed, contradicts him, or alters his message in any substantive way, they are wrong. As such, Christianity is errant, as are Judaism and Islam. YAHOWAH, YAHOWAH, an accurate transliteration of the name of Eloah, God guided by his Torah, instructions regarding his Hayah, existence in our Shalom, reconciliation, reigns by guiding, Melech, as king in charge, providing advice and counsel, direction and support, forever, Olam, into perpetuity in time without end, as an eternal witness, Ad, with enduring testimony. Gentile institutions and individuals, Goim, non-Yisraelite countries, cultures, societies, governments, beliefs, ethnicities, and people, will be expelled and cease to exist, Abad, will be annihilated and exterminated, wiped out and destroyed, their lives squandered for having wandered away, they will be driven out for having lacked the necessary knowledge, vanishing and perishing, from within his land and earth, Min, Eretz who, out of his country, region, place, and material realm. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 16. It is his land and his home. It is even his planet and universe. He conceived all life within it. As such, he is entitled to include or expel whomever he sees unfit to live in it. The ability to participate in the covenant and become part of God's family is the most compelling reason for us to disassociate from Gentile influences, their nations and institutions. Doing so is a prerequisite, but this is another. All things Goim are going to be driven away and destroyed. Call it Yahowah's one-state solution or people for peace, as in ridding his land of the worst of them. There will be no Palestinians or other Muslims, no Roman Catholics or other Christians, no communists or other progressive protesters, and no conspirators or other anti-Semites. The only question remaining for these corrupting influences is whether, after being expelled, they will also be exterminated as if they were rats carrying the plague. Either way, separated from Yahowah and his people, they will soon die. For those of us who were Gawi by birth, this prophetic assessment should underscore the merit of being adopted into Yahowah's family, of walking away from politics and religion, militarism and conspiracy, of being grafted into the tree of lives. The less Gawim that stain us, the better. The more we grow to reflect the intended purpose of Yehuda, the more we will be loved by Yah. In this light, it is interesting that the far right and extreme left concur on one thing, as do the secular and sectarian, even Christians and Muslims, a festering hatred for Yisrael and Yehudim. Anti-Semitism has become part of Goyim DNA. Even progressive Jews in America have become so Goyish they no longer support or identify with Yehuda or Yisrael. It has been a long time since anyone has listened to Yahuwah, but that does not mean that God has been deaf to the anguishing pleas of his people. The yearning, ta'awah, the longing and desire, of the straightforward, unpretentious, and responsive, anah, of those who are sincere and yet not esteemed within society, those the culture dictates a low status to and deprives of rights, property, possessions, or life, you have heard, Shama, you have listened to, Cal perfect. Yahuwah, Yahuwah, God's personal and proper name, pronounced, Yehovah, based upon Haya, to exist and Torah, to guide, you help shape and develop, Kun, you help fashion and formulate, establish and prove, sustain and authenticate, their ability to make reasoned decisions, Lebhem, their capacity to discern right from wrong, their inclinations and thinking, their attitude for exercising good judgment. Your ears are used to listen attentively so that you can respond appropriately, Ozen Adakashab, you perceive what they are saying through your faculty of hearing and reply accordingly, Hyphal imperfect. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 17. One of the many distinctions between believing and knowing is the ability to avoid puffery and be straightforward in our approach to God. We aren't trying to impress anyone with our faith, Yahuwah included. We can be sincere in our quest for answers and forthright in our expressions of trust. Based upon Yah's statement, it is such people that he hears, ostensibly because we listen to him. We may say 1,000,000 times less than those who pray without ceasing, but what we convey manages to tickle God's ears. We have long understood that Yahuwah made us such that we could choose to be receptive to him so that we could learn what we need to know to relate to him. This realization is strengthened by the previous declaration. God designed us to be perceptive and discerning. He bestowed us with the capacity to exercise good judgment. It is by listening to God that we learn how to respond properly to him. By doing justice on behalf of, Shabat, by defending and providing legal aid to, by litigating on behalf of and executing justice, deciding between right and wrong, good and bad, guilt and innocence of, the fatherless, Yatham, the orphan and defenseless, the ones unable to protect themselves who are seeking to rely on the proper parent, from Yather, those who remain and are searching in Yather, the remnant left behind, and, the oppressed, Dak, the harassed and persecuted. Subjugated and demeaned, no longer will, Bal Yasaf Aud, never again throughout eternity will, mortal man, in Aush, humankind, strike terror, Laerats, terrorize, invoking fear, or perpetrating oppression, upon the earth, Min Ha-Eretz, within the land or material realm. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 18. We have long recognized that, for God to be just, the religious and political, the conspiratorial and militaristic, must be exposed and condemned. We have also known that they must be expunged from the earth to end their reign of terror in order to keep those they have oppressed safe. Nonetheless, it's always reassuring to hear Yahuwah affirm these conclusions as he has done here. In summation, just as there were no political or religious influences in Eden, their stench won't ruin the millennial kingdom either. Good riddance. Speaking of such things, and in context with our return to the garden, I've noticed a pattern I'd like to share. In each of these Mizmor Psalms, a considerable amount of the text has been devoted to exposing Shaul Paul and ridding the world of his caustic influence. It is as if Dowd is announcing the subject of his final battle. Christian theologians have dismissed much of what Dowd wrote, put off by the notion that David was incessantly complaining against his personal enemies. But in actuality, Dowd's message is prophetic, explaining his fulfillment of the Moedim, including his triumphant return when he will be working with Yahuwah to free his people from their most menacing enemy. He's establishing the final battle lines between right and wrong. In the process, the first 10 Psalms systematically dismantled Christian theology and eschatology, destroying the credibility of Paul's rancid letters along with almost everything that has been falsely attributed to the Christian God, Jesus Christ. Each of the first 10 Mizmor strives to return our focus to Yahuwah, his Torah and its covenant, to God's relationship with Dowd and all that implies, especially to Yisrael and Yehuda. Gentiles and their church aren't the answer but are instead the problem. Somehow, either blinded or rendered irrational, Christians have completely missed this message. Every word scribed by Dowd David undermines the foundation of their religion, destroys the myths they have attributed to their God, and exposes their scriptures as fraudulent. And as goes Christianity, so falls Judaism and Islam, which would not exist without it. It's well past time we forego every lingering aspect of eschatology and recognize that the final battle isn't Armageddon, but it is instead the annihilation of all religious and political influences. The 10th Mizmor Psalm has been overtly condemning Shaul because of the caustic influence he has had on God's people. For what reason and until when, is your presence so far away, distant and separated, Amad Ba Rachok, Yahuwah, Yahuwah, concealed, Alam, in times, Ba, of drought and destitution, of being cut off and restrained, Batsera. Mizmor 10:1. With arrogance, unwarranted status, and presumptuous pride, Yahoah, the dishonest, condemnable, and guilty, Rasha, with inflamed passions and burning animosity, persecute and harass, Dalek, the outspoken and unpretentious without political or religious status, any. Let him be seized and forced to endure, Taphaz, the evil devices, Ba Mazima, that they have imagined, invented, and devised, Zuchashab. Mizmor 10:2. Indeed, Ky, the dishonest and fraudulent, Rasha, improperly slanders and insanely boasts, arrogantly making a fool of himself, Halal, based upon, what his soul desires, Taiwa Nipeshu. And, the one who wrongfully severs the relationship and inspires violence for ill-gotten gain, Batsa, commends, pretending to bless while advocating, Barak, that which is abhorred and condemned, despised and rejected, Naats, by Yahuwah, Yahuwah. Mizmor 10:3. The deceitful one who is wrong, Rasha, as if high and mighty in a lofty position, exalts in the arrogance, Kagoba, of his resentment and animosity, Afu. He will never, Baal, be an honest seeker or engage in the relationship, Darash. All, Kol, of his decisions, schemes, and thoughts, Mazimahu, contradict and negate, Ein, God, Elohim. Mizmor 10:4. Throughout time, Ba Kol, Heth, his way, Derek who, endures replete with twisted perversions as he dances about causing anguishing torment, Chol. Your means to exercise good judgment and justly resolve disputes, Mishpat Ada, are elevated high above and beyond, Marom Min, what is before him and conspicuous in his sight, Negtu. With all, Ba Kol, of his troubles and adversity, Sarahu, he becomes a loud-mouthed blowhard, Puwach, regarding them, Ba Hem. Mizmor 10:5. He has said, Amar, through his reasoning, Ba Lebhu, I shall never be shaken, waver, or falter, be cast down or decay, Baal Mot, throughout the generations, times, and places, Wadower, such that, Asher, I am never in the wrong or considered the adversary, Lo Bara. Mizmor 10:6. His mouth, Pehu, is filled with an abundance, male, of vile insults and injurious curses invoking divine retribution, Allah. In addition, he deliberately misleads using deceitful deceptions in perpetrating an outright fraud, treacherously betraying, murmur, along with, distressful spoken statements which create a state of oppression, talk. It is a consequence of, Takhath, his nauseatingly, Amal, evil and corrupting, on, tongue, Lashonhu. Mizmor 10:7. He lurks in ambush, Yasha Ba Myrab, openly in the courtyards of communities, Ba HaChatzar. While the central figure, he's not easily recognized or forthcoming, seldom acknowledged or held accountable, Ba HaMistar, as he kills, forestalling the lives, Herod, of the innocent, Naki. His sights are set, Einhu, on the unfortunate victims, La Kalaka, waylaying them, Safan. Mizmor 10:8. He has set a deceptive trap for humans by covertly weaving a ruse, spinning a web of lies, and intertwining a twisted snare through artifice and trickery, Arab, where the identity of the one disguising his intent isn't recognized, Ba HaMistar. He has done so in the manner of a ferocious and destructive predator wandering from one place to another whose destiny is to violently pluck away, from within his tents that he uses to screen his presence, Ba Saku, cunningly commingling and deceptively twisting everything to craftily ensnare, Arab. In this way, he seizes, La Chataf, the oppressed and persecuted, Eni. He abducts and carries off, Chataf, those he has deprived of rights and resources, Eni, by drawing them into, Ba Mashkem Ba, his net to dispossess, disinherit, and impoverish, Rishay. Mizmor 10:9. Those who cower and bow down in submission, hopelessly and helplessly bowing their heads, Shachak, he crushes and destroys, disparages and pummels, Daka. Treated as inferior, his victims fall, Naphal Kalaka, by the multitudes associated with him, Ba at Samhu. Mizmor 10:10. From his disposition and inclination, Ba Lebhu, he says, Amar, God, El, isn't mindful, he no longer responds appropriately, and thus he should be ignored. Forgetful, he should be forgotten because he can no longer be found, Shaka. His presence, Panahu, will not be observed or seen, Baal Area Allah, for the foreseeable future, La Netzach. Mizmor 10:11. You and I are in agreement that you must take a stand, Kyum, Yahowah. You have decided to lift up your hand, Massa, Yet Ada, God, El. You will never overlook or forget, Al Shaka, those who have been demeaned, impoverished, and persecuted, Eni. Mizmor 10:12. On what basis and for what reason does, Alma, the fraudulent one who is wrong about engaging in religious malfeasance, Rasha, discredit and renounce, contradict and negate, Naats, God, Elohim? Based upon his inclinations, Ba Lebhu, he says, Amar, you will not care about or account for this, Lo, Darash. Mizmor 10:13. However, Ky, you do see for yourself, Area Ada, the effort that is put forth to create perversions causing trouble and misery, Amal. And, you do consider, Nabat, these as annoying provocations, Kaaz, therefore, taking, La Nathan, into your hands for yourself, Ba Yet Ada Al Ada, those who remain and who have renounced prior affiliations, Azab. Those who have been victimized, Kalaka, and the fatherless, Yathaum, you exist to, Adahaya, aid and support, Azar. Mizmor 10:14. Your will is to crush, Shabar, the leadership capabilities of this shepherd and the outreach, Zeroah, of the deceitful one who is wrong and religious, Rasha, this one who by being a loud-mouthed evil countryman severs the relationship through improper means, Wa'are, accounting for, Darash, his fraudulent religious malfeasance, Rasha, until you find that there is nothing left to be uncovered, Baal Matzah. Mizmor 10:15. Yahowah, reigns by guiding, Melech, forever, Aulam, as an eternal witness, Ad. Gentile institutions and individuals, Gawim, will be expelled and cease to exist, Abad, from within his land and earth, Min, Eretzu. Mizmor 10:16. The yearning, Towrah, of the straightforward, unpretentious, and responsive, Anah, you have heard, Shama. Yahowah, you help shape and develop, Kun, their ability to make reasoned decisions, Lebhem. Your ears are used to listen attentively so that you can respond appropriately, Ozan Adakashub. Mizmor 10:17. By doing justice on behalf of and defending, La Shapat, the fatherless, Yathaum, and, the oppressed, Dak, no longer will, Baal Yasaf out, mortal man, in Aush, strike terror, La Eretz, upon the land or earth, Min Ha Eretz. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 10 verse 18. Yada Yahowah. We are witnessing the future of the world through fresh eyes. Almost everything our culture has indoctrinated us into believing is false, and much of what we have been encouraged to discount and ignore about God is true. Let's continue. To La, concerning approaching, the everlasting and majestic guide, Ha-Natzak, the eminent and enduring director who continuously leads, of Dowd, the beloved, Dowd, of the one who is loved, of the close friend and adored associate. With B.A. in Yahowah, Yahowah, the proper pronunciation of the name of Eloah, God as directed in his Torah, teaching regarding his higher existence Nar Shalom, restoration, I find someone I can trust to keep me safe, Chasa, I am comfortable, restful, and reliant, at peace, protected, in perfect harmony by having properly placed my confidence. So why would you say, Ike Amar, how is it that you claim, of my soul, La Nipesh Eni, my consciousness, my character and inner nature, my personality, proclivities, and aptitudes, flee, nud, flutter away, wandering and aimless, shaken and lamenting while going astray, rebellious from grievances, traveling with no specific destination in mind, homeless and destitute, even squawking and complaining, to your mountain like a bird, Har Adam Tzipor, for your mount flying with wings? Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 11 verse 1. Religious leaders would have dowed David all but disappear. For them, his life was little more than an aimless pursuit of personal grievances, his words lamentable, his attitude that of an incurable complainer. But most of all, they are bothered by the fact that God said of him and did through him everything that they have sought to attribute to themselves or others. They would have him flutter and fly away and then remain in the place they view with contempt, Zion Zion. The easiest way to simulate this flight of fancy was to take that which was redeeming from him and give what God bestowed to another. In so doing, at least in their eyes, his life became irrelevant, as did his kingdom, his titles, his people, his purpose, his prophecies, and his songs. Even his relationship as the Son of God was reduced to being nothing more than the forefather of a nameless Messiah. What had been written about him was spun in the subterfuge of replacement theology. They took the unrecognizable result and applied it to themselves, their expectations, and their incarnation of salvation. In this regard, Dowd was observant but not the least bit amused. He put us all on notice. This is brilliantly written and vividly depicted. Indeed, behold, Ky Haina, on the contrary, pay attention, those guilty of vexing religious malfeasance, Rasha, those who are wrong, evil, and hostile to God, the wicked and contemned for lack of ethics, those culpable of horrid frauds and massive crimes, have bent, Derak, have set out to shoot, the bow, Cachet, the weapons which project their deadly influence and power. They have fashioned and aimed, Kun, they have formed and shaped, prepared and directed, for Kukatinae suggests man, to aim or direct, arrows, Chethem, missiles as weapons, plural in the extant one Kukatinae, upon the string, Al Yeter, to the bow, the cord, and sinew, to shoot, La Yara, to move destructively, through, Bamo, in the midst of, the darkness and shadows, awful, the depression and despair of being unreceptive, even calamity and terror, the doom and gloom derived from a lack of light, at those who are straightforward and correct, La Yasher, at those who are on the level and right. In their thinking and judgment. Leb, in their inclinations and disposition, in their understanding and decisions, in their core being, nature, and heart, in their conscience, reflections, and resolution, even courage and determination. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 11 verse 2. This is prophetically addressing the times when Imperial Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire, and all that would grow out of this beast, including Orthodox and Protestant Christianity, European kingdoms, and indeed the Third Reich bent the bow of religious malfeasance and pointed their arrows directly at Yahowah's people, Yehudim Jews. The following statement is a rhetorical question. Dowd is asking us if we know the most appropriate way to respond to what Paul and his Roman Catholic Church have done to demean and replace Yahowah, his Torah, and covenant. Indeed, when, ky, because by contrast, as, the most basic principles, ha-shath, the foundation and essential elements, that which frames and defines the issues, the very purpose and means of support, from shydh, that which is put in place, appointed, and fixed, constituting the proper mindset and response, are torn down, are broken apart and dismantled, damaged, demolished, or destroyed, then overthrown and superimposed by something considered superior, nifle imperfect pedagogic none. The subject carries out and receives the action of the verb on an ongoing basis as an expression of volition in the first person. What should those who are right do? Sadik mapal. What should be accomplished and done by those who are correct? What should be prepared and performed by and engaged in by the upright, those in accord with the standard who are vindicated? Cal perfect. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 11 verse 3. Dowd David knew the answer, which is why he was asking the question. We know it too because we have read what Yahowah inspired him to compose. And having studied his response, it should reflect our own. And in this regard, the Messiah and Son of God is blatantly and boldly confrontational, ever prepared, willing, and ready to expose and condemn that which is, Rasha, wrong. Let's be clear, the most basic principles of the Torah have been assailed and dismantled by Christianity. It began with his name. The Christian God would not be known as Yahowah but, instead, called the Lord Jesus Christ. Yahowah's teaching and guidance would be mischaracterized as a laborious list of arcane laws which were no longer relevant and could neither be obeyed nor saved. Yahowah's covenant was replaced with a new and different one, completely detached from the Torah and Yisrael. Its conditions and benefits would be forgotten and annulled, each superseded by religious mandates. The invitations to be called out and meet with God would suffer a similar fate, each superseded by a Babylonian holiday, beginning with Christmas and Easter. The Shabat was torn asunder as Sunday came to reign as the Lord's Day. Hebrew was discarded in favor of Greek, then Latin, as the truth was lost in the translation. Yisrael was demeaned and cast aside for a Gentile church. The intended relationship became a fraudulent religion. Truth gave way to faith. Reliability became changeability as consistency was overthrown by contradiction. Even Daud, Yahowah's beloved son, chosen one, branch, protective shepherd, set apart one, anointed Messiah, sacrificial lamb, and eternal king would be mischaracterized in order to make Jesus appear credible. Even then, after affording their Savior a Greek name and title, Christians would deprive Daud of his role as the Passover lamb, negating their salvation. Prayer, defined as talking to God, replaced Shamat listening to him as man's opinions took precedence over Yahowah's testimony. From there, it would be a simple matter to bewilder the masses such that they would reject the truth and believe even the most perverted of lies. God would be born as a baby on Christmas Day. He would die. His symbol would be that of a dead god on a stick. The Passover lamb would be resurrected on Easter Sunday. The Babylonian Trinity would be ordained as godly. And the adversarial Lord, Satan, himself, would be worshipped as if he were God. The chosen people would be condemned as inferior by Romans, then Roman Catholics, so that the Gentile Church could predicate their new religion on supersessionism. Those advancing such lies would be admired and enriched while those refuting them would be scorned and ridiculed. Welcome to the here and now that these Mizmor Psalms have been assailing. As recently as the spring of 2020, the Lutheran Church's Danish Bible Society published a revised translation of the Christian New Testament called The New Agreement. These anti-Semitic advocates of replacement theology not only excluded Yahowah's Torah, prophets, and Psalms, they excluded Israel. Ignoring the obvious, that present-day Israel is located within the boundaries God depicted, that the population is comprised of Yehudim Jews, that their official language is Hebrew, and that there are countless prophetic declarations depicting Yahowah's return to Yisrael on behalf of Yisraelites, the Bible Society justified their conspiratorial animosity and rancid racism by falsely claiming, the ancient Israelites are not linked in any substantive or material way to the contemporary modern state of Israel. The biblical narrative of Israel has almost nothing to do with contemporary Israel other than the intentional manipulation of sacred texts to justify a political project. Cited from a speech given by Evangelical Lutheran Church pastor, Robert O. Smith, a stalwart of the World Council of Churches and proponent of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel. When liars lie, especially religious narcissists and self-aggrandizing psychopaths, they almost always project their own faults on those they oppose. That is precisely what occurred here. It is the Danish Bible Society that is trying to justify a political project. And they have manipulated their sacred texts to claim for themselves something that has nothing to do with them. At the same anti-Semitic conference, a Fakistinian Lutheran pastor, Mitri Raheb, chimed in, "It wasn't the Lord God who promised Israel the land, it was the Lord Balfour." He would indict himself further with, Jesus was a Middle Eastern Palestinian Jew. That is akin to claiming that a camel is the result of mating an extinct ass with a lion. While I can't speak for the Lord, Yahowah spoke of Yisrael, Sion, and Jerusalem over 3,000 times in his Torah, promising to return to this very place on behalf of his people. And fortunately, based upon what Daud revealed in his Mizmor, those of us who have come to love what Yahowah adores will not have to endure the putrid presence or jaundiced verbiage of those who oppose Yehudim or Yisrael. Life is about exclusion and inclusion. We are each afforded the opportunity to choose between God and man. Long ago, some 14 billion years looking back from our relative position in the universe, 6 days ago from God's, Yahowah made a decision he would never change. Since he created the universe, conceived life, authored his Torah, and offered his covenant to become part of a family, anything our Heavenly Father could do with us or through us, he would not do alone. In heaven, he has positioned and empowered us to expose and condemn those who would do that which he has warned against. Whether or not we engage as he intended is up to us. But be aware, even though Yah is leaving this up to us, he is aware of our choices in this regard. Yahowah, Yahowah, an accurate transliteration of the name of Eloah, God guided by his Torah, instructions, is in his set-apart sanctuary, Ba Heikel Kodesh who is positioned within his separated and uncommon residence, from Yakel, having the capacity and power to endure, overcome, and prevail. Yahowah's, Yahowah, God's one and only name, pronounced, Yehovah, based upon Haya, to exist, seat of honor, Kais, who, his throne, place of authority and status, is in the heavens, Ba Hashemayim, placed within the spiritual realm. He uses his faculty of sight to perceive what can be observed regarding the agreement, Einhu Chaza, his eyes see, beholding visions by choosing to receive certain information, conveying that message prophetically to communicate for the purpose of perception and discernment regarding his contractual relationship. His gaze, like a beam of light, Aphapym who, his glances, like flashing rays, examine and communicate through his ability to jump through light, assesses, Bakon, probes, examines, and tests, providing proof as it scrutinizes, the children of man, Beni Adam, the sons of Adam. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 11 verse 4. For most of the past 3,000 years, Yahowah has been hands-off, allowing man to do as he pleased. He intervened to provide this prophetic testimony through prophets such as Yashaya, Yirmiah, Zechariah, Haushah, and Malachi, but he has been silent ever since. He consented to have his beloved son, Daud, fulfill his obligation to serve as the Passover lamb and to honor his promise on behalf of the covenant regarding unyeasted bread, firstborn children, and the promise of 7. And he has intervened through his Malachi spiritual representatives to protect those who were about his business. That's it. There has been nothing more. And that isn't because he wanted it to be that way, but because we left him with no other viable option. Yahowah looked for someone who was willing but found no one, not one over the course of a score of centuries. Now that we are approaching the time of God's final return, Yahowah is moving among his people, inspiring those devoted to the prospect of calling his people home. He is easier to find and know now than ever before. God wants to interact with his children. It is all he has ever wanted. But for that to occur, we have to do our part. Our approach to God must be based upon the facts, our assessment of his testimony must be accurate, and we must respond correctly. When this occurs, our motives will be genuine. Yahowah, Yahowah, God's personal and proper name, pronounced, Yahowah, based upon Haya, to exist, examines the genuineness, Bakon, observes, closely examining and carefully considering, even testing the reaction, of those who are upright and correct, tzaddik, of those who are right, in accord with the standard, and thus vindicated. But, Wa, the deceitful one who is wrong and religious, Rasha, the fraudulent, wicked, and evil one guilty of leading others astray by engaging in criminal activity which is hostile to God, dishonest regarding the proper standard, opposite of what is right and opposed to the Torah, who speaks contrary to it, who is vexing and unethical, even ungodly, and, Wa, the one who is fond of, Akab, who desires, romances, and becomes familiar with, who is a friend to, associates with, and shows a predilection and love for, violence, Hamas, that which is wrong and destructive, that which terrorizes and maims without moral restraint, plundering and looting others, a concept emblazoned in the name of the Islamic terrorist gang, Hamas. He hates his soul, Saint Nipesh, who, he loathes and detests such an individual, he disdains and abhors this person, he intensely dislikes, shuns, and rejects this life and consciousness. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 11 verse 5. Volume 1 of Observations commenced with, hate is a virtue. It was not my opinion or my idea. Saying so did not make me ignorant or mistaken. It is God's conclusion. Not that God needs anyone to defend him, but nonetheless, evidence and reason dictate that he is correct in his assessment. Humankind has been mistreated, abused, deceived, and traumatized for the past 5,000 years because far too few people have had the courage or compassion to oppose the religious, political, militaristic, and conspiratorial influences which have been so universally corrupting and corrosive. Unless far more of us learn what and how to hate, the caustic influences which have stained every human civilization and bloodied humankind will continue to be as destructive and deadly, as deceitful and damning as they have been from the beginning of time. Terror exists and prevails because there isn't one in a million of us who has invested the time, who has demonstrated the courage, who has embraced the characteristics which caused Yahowah to inspire doubt, and who, as a result, is willing to expose and condemn Islam, the religion responsible for 95% of today's terrorist atrocities. There isn't one in a million who understands and despises what Paul wrote sufficiently to systematically disavow Christian deceptions, holding the religion accountable for the crimes it has committed against man and God. There isn't one in a million willing to explain why we should not be political or patriotic, providing the reasons to not support a political party, military, spy organization, international diplomacy, or religion. Until far more people come to their senses, shed their ignorance, develop some character, and start thinking rationally, deceit and violence will continue to ravage our world, with its carnage littering every place on earth. For love to prevail, hate must exist. For the truth to be known and accepted, lies must be loathed. There are many things that God has identified worthy of our disdain. For us to do as we should, they must be known, understood, exposed, and condemned, all with words wielded wisely using evidence and reason. Before we move on, I want to reinforce two things that are essential to Yahowah in this regard. God said that he hates the soul of the individual who disseminates lies on behalf of religion and who advocates violence. This means two things. First, we should never promote violence as a solution to any problem. We must use words. Second, we must acknowledge that religion and other forms of deceit live within the souls of their advocates. The treacherous will continue to be corrosive as long as the proponents of such tactics live. This is why Yahowah will be expelling and exterminating them. It also means that it is appropriate for us to condemn the most vocal and notorious proponents of delusions since Yah clearly holds them in disdain. The idea of a prison whose bars are comprised of light appears intriguing, especially fitting and proper. He will bring down, matar, he will cause to fall, raining, on those who mislead and are mistaken, the deceitful and religious, al-rasha, on those who have been corrupted and are wrong, those who are invalid, fraudulent, and unethical, leading others astray, and who, by being opposed to what is right have done or spoken that which is inappropriate and confusing and should be condemned, a means of incarceration, patch, a confining means of control, a snare, comprised of fire, esh, made of flames, burning light and combustible material, that which glows brightly and burns hotly, and brimstone, wagafrith, sulfur, a yellow element which burns blue, emitting poisonous and noxious fumes, in addition to, wa, a scorching spirit of righteous indignation, zaleh ruach, a rightfully and appropriately opposed and angry spirit, one that is suitably enraged, a fitting receptacle and an appropriate fate for them, maneth cows hem. The portion that encapsulates their destiny, the cup which has been assigned to them based upon what they have contributed to this vessel, a dutiful decree and decision of God. Mizmor/lyrics to sing/Psalm 11 verse 6. It has become obvious that Yah despises everything associated with Rasha. Eternal incarceration in a cell comprised of burning sulfur while enduring the righteous indignation of an angry spirit does not sound appealing. So, by all means, let's avoid being Rasha, misleading or mistaken, religious and thus deceitful, corrupted or corrupting, wrong and thus invalid, fraudulent, or unethical. Let's be careful and not lead anyone astray, always avoiding that which is inappropriate and confusing in relation to God. Being tzaddik right is clearly a better idea. In fact, Rasha is being presented in direct contrast to being tzaddik. One is wrong and the other is right. And therein is the difference between life and death, Yahowah and Satan, Shemaim or Shiao. Concerning, ky, surely, instead and by contrast, because on behalf of, those who are right and thus vindicated, tzaddik, those who are upright and correct, and therefore acquitted, Yahowah, Yahowah, the proper pronunciation of the name of Eloah, God as directed in his Torah, teaching regarding his higher existence and our shalom, restoration, loves, Ahab, desires and adores, establishing a close personal relationship with, the upright and correct, tzedakah, those who are right and thus vindicated, the just and innocent who prosper by deciding appropriately. The straightforward and reasonable, Yasher, those who are on the level and consistent, shall gaze upon, Chaza, shall observe and behold, look upon and see, Kal imperfect, his face, Panahu, his appearance and presence. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 11 verse 7. There are a significant number of things we need to know, understand, accept, and act upon to appear before Yahuwah and, more importantly, receive his love. But in the end, all of them are bound together by a single idea, tzadak, being right. When it comes to being correct about Yahuwah, the thing I enjoy more than learning the truth is sharing it. From the very beginning, through 22 years and 35 books, we have been committed to more correctly and completely translating Yahuwah's words, contemplating their implications, and going to where his guidance leads. Everything Yahuwah has revealed on our behalf leads to tzadak being right. Good thing because, as it turns out, being tzadak right provides direct access to Yahuwah's presence and his love. In a world fixated on faith and hope, on being politically correct even when it means being wrong, it is reassuring to know that from Yahuwah's perspective nothing matters more than knowing and accepting the truth. This means that everything we have translated and contemplated over the years has served a purpose, giving the open-minded and willing the opportunity to be tzadak. We should not be surprised by any of this, including the simplicity of it all. Even with Abraham and Yitzhak, there was a test, one where they were able to prove that their understanding and responses were correct. And speaking of being right, even in this short psalm, Yahuwah's name appeared 4 times. Knowing and using Yahuwah's name is the first step to heaven. To La, the everlasting and majestic guide, Ha-Natzak, of Daud, the beloved, Daud. With Ba, Yahowah, Yahowah, I find someone I can trust to keep me safe such that I am comfortable, confident, and harmonious, Chasa. So why would you say, Ike Amar, of my soul, La Nipesh Eni, flee, Nud, to your mountain like a bird, Har Adam Tzipor. Mizmor 11:1. Indeed, behold, Ky Hina, those guilty of vexing religious malfeasance, Rasha, have bent, Derak, the bow, Cachet. They have fashioned and aimed, Kun, arrows, Chetz-hem, upon the string, Al Yether, to shoot, La Yara, through, Bamo, the darkness and shadows, awful, at those who are straightforward and correct, La Yasher, in their thinking and judgment, Leb. Mizmor 11:2. Indeed, when, Ky, the most basic principles, Ha-Shath, are torn down, Harris, what should those who are right do, Tzadik Mapa'al? Mizmor 11:3. Yahuwah, Yahowah, is in his set-apart sanctuary and royal residence, Ba Heikel Kodesh Hu. Yahuwah's, Yahuwah, seat of honor, Kai's, who, is in the heavens, Ba Hashemaim. He uses his faculty of sight to perceive what can be observed regarding the agreement, Ein Hu Chaza. His gaze, like a beam of light, Apha Phym Hu, assesses, Bakon, the children of man, Beni Adam. Mizmor 11:4. Yahuwah, Yahowah, examines the genuineness, Bakon, of those who are upright and correct, Tzadik. But, Wa, the deceitful one who is wrong and religious, Rasha, and, Wa, the one who is fond of, Akab, violence, Hamas, he hates his soul, Saint Nipeshu. Mizmor 11:5. He will bring down, Matar, on those who mislead and are mistaken, the deceitful and religious, Al-Rasha, a means of incarceration, Patch, comprised of burning light, Esh, and brimstone, Wagafrith, in addition to, Wa, a scorching spirit of righteous indignation, Zaleh Rowak, a fitting receptacle and an appropriate fate for them, Manath Cowshem. Mizmor 11:6. Concerning, Ky, those who are right and thus vindicated, Tzadik, Yahuwah, Yahowah, loves, Ahab, the upright and correct, Tzedakah. The straightforward and reasonable, Yasher, shall gaze upon, Chaza, his face, Panahu. Mizmor/lyrics to sing Psalm 11 verse 7. Yod Hey Wah Hey.